Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm sitting here with Rita van der Schuyf, and we are talking about salience and the different projects that Rita is involved in. If you go back to the previous episodes, we've been talking about radical town transformation, and we've been talking a lot about the key players in town transformation. And today we are going to talk a bit more about the practical nature of it.
Yes.
How did you become a town transformation specialist?
I think there's obviously kind of on the one hand, one's own mind and one's own interest, but then also the brand that you create. So on the one hand, there was this notion that I as a person, I'm just drawn to almost from a very young age, how do I actually get to greater places of efficiency, organize my dolls in a very perfect way, and then being a lot more efficient. So the complexity and finding process in that and finding clarity in that is something that my brain is innately drawn to. I think, as I kind of previously mentioned, some of the other podcasts, the other thing that also kind of led me to become a town transformation specialist is also this absolute inspirational opportunity to actually contribute to society on a fairly large scale and hopefully to turn that into success that allows a potential for others to be unlocked. But I think on the other hand is I developed unintentionally a reputation for being a bit of a futurist, that can see a little bit ahead. There are many of us that can do that, so I'm not saying that per se is unique, but also that have this ability to actually find ways of how to make decisions or how to find progress or how to actually find the next steps where others are perhaps not there yet. Mm-hmm. And I think it's those combinations of one hand, my reputation, and the other predisposition, and then actual, heart's calling to kind of, hopefully make a difference.
Was the title of futurist assigned to you?
It was assigned to me, and it was actually something that was a little bit foreign in the beginning because, of course, if you're a futurist, especially when you're young, you've got no idea because you just see these opportunities and they are so obvious to you. And then it was almost kind of when I was met with somewhat resistance or perhaps occasionally not relation to it, I began to understand, well, maybe there's something in my communication. Mm-hmm. If I just improve my communication, they're going to see the potential. But then later understood that, just a little bit earlier, I wouldn't say that I'm the 50-year, 100-year futurist, but have this fortune to perhaps in a 5 to 20-year cycle, you see trends or spot some trends, of course not all. And therefore, it was actually first assigned to me by somebody that worked for me.
Okay.
Dawned on me that might be the disease I suffer from.
It's a good disease to have.
It's a good disease to have, but trust me, there's been moments where it's felt more like an infliction than a gift.
I have to say, there are probably way worse titles to have, right?
yes. That's true. That's certainly true.
Okay, and Rita, town transformations are inherently complex projects. Where do you even begin?
It's a great question to ask because, of course, that doesn't always kind of seem obvious, but you do begin to, of course, build an understanding of what that current state is. Again, is it something that needs to be transformed because of an environmental disaster or whatever the impetus has been? We've covered those quite a bit. But I think you begin by first and foremost really just truly understand the context in which you're needing to operate. Who are the people, who are the decision makers, what decisions need to be made, what is the potential of that environment, either economically, geographically, socially. Just get to really, truly understand so you've got a sense of that place. Then very soon after that, what you need to do is to begin to create and shape a vision. Even if it's not yet your perfect end state, just where are we heading? Are we clear on what we're wanting to achieve? And are we clear that we understand what those objectives are and that we can actually really well articulate that? Because, like, let's say in some instances, when you begin to transform a place, some people may have much higher ambitions or make assumptions that are very different to what is possible in that area, or at least at that stage. And then I think that third thing where I really begin to spend a lot of time is to begin to build trust and relationships with people, so that when it comes to those difficult moments where you need to build and or make difficult decisions, you've got a rapport to understand where might they come from, what might be their position. How can I give them assurance that, what might kind of be obstacles for them can be addressed, and that one can have very frank discussions about that, even to a point where they can disclose where some of their fears or insecurities or challenges sit. So I think it is then around that stakeholder management and building rapport, not just the trust element, but for you to truly understand their positions, so that you can begin to understand how they think and should think and what drives their decisions, to actually allow you to give more textured options and proposals to them that will make sense from their perspective. So those are the three places where I typically start.
It's a lot of groundwork to cover before you actually start.
Correct. Yes, because quite often people invite you to say, and come and solve this problem for town transformation, and let's appoint you for a year, and then my answer would always be, no, rather appoint me for a month or 2 months. And let's first build an understanding of what the real problem is. And once we know the real problem and the real opportunity and what it might take, a sober view at the opportunity, real crystal clear sober view, only from then do we decide, are you still open to embarking on this opportunity if you have the choice, if of course you have the luxury of the choice. In some cases you have no choice and you have to do it. But then do we really understand what's at stake and how do we want to approach it and what options we have? I think that's then a lot more sober. So it's actually, yes, keep the romance, but demystify it so that there's a much more sober and almost, I would say, humble approach to this problem.
And I think being called in for something like that, it's of course where experience plays a huge role.
Absolutely.
Because it might be simpler or easier. That might be a simplification of how I put it, but simpler for you to actually identify the actual thing. Because people, let's say, directly involved in a town or a place don't necessarily see what the actual issues are. And that is where you play the key role.
Correct. And can highlight that that's not always easy because people don't always welcome going to the soft belly.
Of course.
But I think if you go to the soft belly and you do that with the right elements of caution and mindfulness, you get to the better answers faster and you actually avoid wasting time, wasting resources, and also wasting hope. Because quite often I find that people have either they're kind of loath to get involved because they think it's too complex, too expensive, but more often than not, they're naive and overambitious. So they got very high expectations of that environment and have got very little practical appreciation of what it takes to get to that point, and that's perhaps an irrational expectation in this point in time. Again, I'm not there to prescribe people what their hopes should be or what they foresee from their perspectives, but more often than not, it is not tied to reality in the right order. And therefore, it kind of leads to some challenges to bring some sobriety, some kind of soberness into that piece so that money could be well spent. I'm not saying that some misspent will not, of course, any project where it's complex, you might make a few mistakes, but you're not going to make the big mistakes.
I love how you put it, tied to reality in that order, because one needs to be realistic about transformation and how long things take and how practical it is.
Correct. And it's a marathon. It's not a sprint.
Yes.
And it's a marathon in which you want to end well without pain and without injuries. So it's kind of really approaching it from that perspective. But from that, you have to do your prep work well.
Yes.
And that's quite often where it goes wrong.
And I know we spoke about this in, I think, the first episode about your Russian dolls. I think we can touch on that again, the symbolism.
Yes. I think because of the complexity we've just discussed, quite often it becomes easier to actually have some kind of symbol or metaphor to explain to the extent that you have to explain. I'm not saying it's all the case, but it does perhaps explain to people what we do and how we operate. And what the Russian doll, metaphor really represents for us in the case of how we apply to salience, and we use it in different ways, but the one way that I would describe it to you is when one deals with an environment needs to change, the big doll represents the entire environment. And as a consequence, it also implies the people that has the positional power at that collective level. And therefore, quite often it represents, at least in the context of town or city transformations, your public sector. That's one way to kind of look at it, but it is really your collective ecosystem. But of course, the ecosystem per se can't bring about all the changes. It's got many comprising components that forms part of the fiber of that environment. So the middle doll for us represents the institutional levels. And I'm not saying just necessarily purely private sector. It could be any form of institution, whether it's a school, hospital, even public benefit organizations or other government agencies that could be represented through this institutional level. And then the smallest doll represents for us the individual citizens in a town setup. And that could be individual leaders, it could be a normal citizen, but it could also be the broader civil society. And what we do is we begin to explain that, of course, work and decision-making needs to happen at this level, or enable needs to happen, and vision creation needs to happen. But the vision creation can't happen with inclusion or without the participation of all of these levels, especially civil society. So, of course, they might have the smallest capability in which to bring about the change directly, but their views into this place, but also their ownership of this environment needs to play a strong role. So it actually speaks to the levels of transformation and the continuation of that across all of these constituent parts of environment. If you allow me just for a second, when we kind of work with companies, then quite often this for us represents the collective company. And this might be all the functional positions or systems or teams in a company. And again, these are your individuals. And again, if you want to bring about commercial transformation or even cultural transformation, the same thing applies. The company can't change the culture. It needs to be the individual leaders and their teams that needs to change their norms, their expectations, their behavior or economic focus, depending on what your goal is, that brings about that transformation. So it was just a nice metaphor that illustrated that continuum and collective. It's not just one part of a system that all of a sudden changes the system. We all take part in that system, and all these parts of the system needs to bring at their level the transformation that is required in either doing or thinking or behaving.
It's all
encompassing.
And I think that also brings us to the 3 pillars.
Oh, you're referring, I think, to the pillars that we use as a source of economic, environment, social. Yes. So, yes, it does sort of correlate to that. But you're absolutely right. We kind of do draw on, again, for simplicity. There's a lot more elements to it. But from a simplistic perspective, refer to the big buckets of transformations, either environmentally. And environmentally, we truly interpret in the intent of that around the physical environment, which includes, therefore, the technical elements. How do you use your land? How do you use your infrastructure? How do you optimally use it? Your land is your biggest asset. So how do you not misdirect its allocation? And then there's the social bucket that speaks to the behavioral elements of people and all the elements that goes into the social well-being of a place. And then the other element is that economic element that speaks to how do you, through economics, in the broadest sense, look at your value chains, where in that can you create texture that allow as many as possible onto that value chains with sense that allows commerce to survive, but also economic flow to be as dense and as textured as it can be, to make sure that there's opportunity for as many as you can into that economic strata. And
just a question, this is what you learned from examples, or this is what you learned from experience? So I have to ask that, because that's...
Yes.
It's a lot.
Both. Definitely both. I mean, I definitely don't come from the notion that any one person knows all of this. A lot of the information that we've gained, of course, has been through the successes or failures of others. So, yes, a lot of research, a lot of relationship, a lot of learning, and, of course, lots of technical skills that combine with that. But, yes, a lot of it also eventually comes down to experience.
Yeah, that's the big thing.
Hard lessons learned, I would say. Happy lessons too.
Yeah, of course.
Sure, but there's definitely been some hard lessons along the way.
Outside of town planning, what else can we look at with regards to transformation?
What town transformation include? Yes, of course, I think the all-encompassing technical components that you've just described is what people are most familiar with. The parts that is often overlooked, and that might or will be implied in some of our communication or sort of dialogue up until now, is this element that you have to, especially when it's a town transformation program, if we take ourselves back, it's a deliberate program created to achieve an outcome. And that outcome almost always will include, to some extent or to a great extent, economic outcomes. So economic infrastructure and redesign is a critical component of the process that takes it beyond the urban planning and town planning that you've alluded to. And then, of course, that all-important social infrastructure. Yes, that includes the obvious notions like school, hospitals, all these more technical ease components, but it includes this very deliberate focus on working on the mindsets and identities of people to make sure that it is ready to embrace the new technical future in which they want to or choose to thrive or need to thrive, and whichever that might be.
And this is also where you mentioned before where the drivers come in.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Absolutely. But that's what takes town transformation a little bit broader than the traditional urban planning.
Okay.
But again, I want to be very clear, urban planning and town planning also needs to consider these elements, but they don't actually drive the strategy for those two other lenses into a town transformation program.
So we have heard of the successes of cities like Dubai, Singapore. It seems that transformation of cities or towns is mainly associated with rich cities like these. How do these examples compare with transforming cities or towns in the African context?
Sure. Yeah, that's quite a tough question to dissect. And I think, yes, one could say, of course, wealthier cities do have, by nature, more means through which to transform, and therefore they can direct funds with greater ease towards these causes of creating alternative futures for places, especially if you look at the spaces like Dubai being a good example, and actually almost more explicitly the Line project in Neom, Saudi Arabia, where clearly a lot of concentrated funding and wealth could be redirected to these projects. That being said, alongside that kind of notion of having resources, where you could argue that developing countries have also a little bit more on the back foot, we've also kind of spoken to that notion that they've a lot of different competing priorities, because by nature, quite often, they have a much larger part of the population that is not in formal employment or is at very low levels of socioeconomic states. And it is always harder to transform places that are in situations of deep poverty. There might be reasons why they're in poverty is because there's not so much technical or economic opportunity, and therefore also make it a little bit harder to transform those places, which again I think speaks to the notions where Africa might be a little bit behind. I'm not saying in all instances, but generally speaking. The other way that I would also like to answer that question, and why it's for me quite a textured question, is the countries that have basic needs met. So there is enough of the population that has their ability to kind of pay for their day-to-day existence as almost the luxury to think beyond the day-to-day survival, and therefore can afford to be a little bit more on the front foot of why they choose to transform places. So I think Africa, at this stage, and not all of Africa, there's lots of Africans that are fast catching up to becoming well-developed countries that are really progressively investing in transformations or city transformations. But I think at the moment they're still dealing with some issues where large parts of their population are below poverty lines and therefore have other priorities in which they have to direct their resources. I think the other point that I would like to add to your component is the absence of skill sets in Africa. I think that comes as part of that bundle, that complicated bundle that we are discussing. But I think, again, I think developing countries, so let's take it to developing countries rather than necessarily Africa, skill sets are beginning to be internalized. And I hope to see that pretty soon they might actually have innovations that will allow them to actually do their transformations in unique ways that's suited to the cultures of Africa, and that it has unique twists on it. And I actually look forward to what that might be as this awakening happens, that they actually, at least in some parts of Africa, can begin to actually, with confidence, take ownership of these opportunities and then begin to shape their landscapes in a way that's befitting to the local environment, the contextual environment for sure, but also the cultural environments.
What you mentioned about Africa, I think there is the possibility once something actually catches on, it could have beautiful ripple effects.
Absolutely. And Africa normally responds to it in that way, which makes me exciting. I was waiting for that tipping point. I mean, you can begin to see, I see a lot more branding of Africa internationally. Namibia alone, 15 years ago, nobody I met in the international context would even know where Namibia was. And now it's definitely coming up, at least on a weekly basis, into a conversation around people wanting to go there or interested in it or aware of its development strategy. So yes, I do think I'm waiting for that. But you also see product exports. I think later Africa becoming proud of the textiles and its colours and its vibrancy, its music. Is I think a huge soft technology that's well adopted internationally. So yes, I feel that we're beginning to near, not across the board, but I think that moment is nearing.
But the hope and the possibilities, they exist. And that brings me to our next question. It's like, how does one actually assess the fitness of a town for transformation?
It's a fantastic question because quite often people get excited about the potential. So if there's a potential to transform a city or town, people often jump to that without, like we said a little bit earlier, really doing their homework. And part of that homework is not just to understand what is the potential. It's also beginning to assess, well, can this place actually be transformed, even if there is the political will, even if there is the financing support or skill support to do that. And that assessment of fitness is going to be on two axes. On the one hand, is it technically possible? Is there enough to create an alternative purpose or future for the town? More often than not, because of human innovation, creative thinking, that is possible or almost probable in almost all cases. So there are definitely some cases where that won't apply. And I definitely have some examples we can go to there.
Yeah, I was about to ask.
But more importantly, and again, I've got perhaps a potentially sensitive answer to that in the context of Namibia, but, let me for a moment, the other level of fitness, which is probably more important, here's where I had hard lessons learned, is even or despite technical capability, more often than not, the readiness of the stakeholders, one or more than one constituency, in that if we use that trifecta of the public sector, private sector and civil society, one or more of one of those groups are not ready. And it's not ready in their sense of ownership, their readiness to commit, their readiness to transform the identity, to unlock the potential for whatever reason. I'm not judging the reasons, but the point is there's actually a level of readiness that is not in that environment that will actually say, yes, we can definitely do some work, but it's going to be tough and it's going to be slow, and it might actually misdirect a lot of resources and energy and credibility almost of that place to be able to do that. So I think the fitness is assessed from a technical perspective, but also then from stakeholder buy-in, stakeholder willingness to align, readiness to embrace a new future, and the momentum and impetus and persuasion that they bring to that is often where this is lost or won.
Do you said you have an example?
Yes, I mean, I think that might be a little bit of a sensitive example, but and I have to kind of quickly caveat, but I can say in the work that I've been doing in the case of Lüderitz, the program refers to Lüderitz and Aus. And Lüderitz, as we know, has been a legacy mining town, and now it's got this huge potential to transform it into a renewable energy player on a really large scale. But in that process, there's an expectation or a preconceived assumption that Aus can and should be transformed at the same time. Now, for people that don't know that, Aus is about, I think, sort of roughly, just about a 90-kilometer distance from Lüderitz, so it's quite substantial still. And years ago, it had a huge role to play in terms of railway interconnection, when rail was still a huge utility in terms of infrastructure utility of how goods were transported. And it still offers a huge intersect for, roads on key access points from Namibia to actually intersect at that particular point. But other than that, that town has got, at the moment, no real economic reason to exist. And it sits in a very difficult situation where it's challenging to get water and sustainable water supplies to it. So to the effort that needs to be injected to actually transform Aus alongside Lüderitz, and at the same time, I would question whether that is a prudent approach to take from the outset. So I'm not saying that Aus should not be transformed, but I would really here recommend to say as well, really think carefully if one shouldn't rather invest really clean and clear efforts to make sure Lüderitz is it reaches a sufficient level of success before additional resources are ploughed into a small town that one have to put in a lot of investment to artificially give it a reason to be, which then can organically happen. But I think that one might be a lot more ambitious at this stage, where Lüderitz has got very clear persuasions, and one could see that would be really sure investment that could add a lot of value, where Aus for me is a bit of a question mark still because of the cost that will have to go into actually making that a viable proposition. So it's not to say it's not possible, but I would argue that one would be, to what extent is Aus technically fit enough?
Just transitions is a new buzzword in the context of socio-economic development. Can you expand on that for me, please?
Yes, it is one of those terms that you increasingly kind of feel is becoming ubiquitous and says a lot, but you kind of have to kind of still question, well, what does it actually really mean? a lot of people are using the phrase just transition to speak about the entirety of a social transformation, so about social reengineering. But more often than not, I feel that it has got the predisposition to be used in the language of social justice and social restitution. And although I don't want to neglect those components, I think we are moving into an era where the emphasis needs to shift towards social inclusion and to social well-being and to social resilience. And I'm just afraid that the term is being co-opted from a political perspective to actually make a lot of promises, but again stays and keeps us very much stuck towards social equality and or social restitution issues. I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that those are not important, but I think there are other fringes, and we need to qualify that statement to then expressly qualify what we mean and what is included by that term so that people are very clear of how it's being used. Because I think I find that a lot of international companies that come to offer their support, whether that's through funding or otherwise, use that term that sounds very promising. But I think it is important that the recipients of that message really qualify into that and say, well, what exactly do you mean? How will you measure it? What value will it really bring on the ground as part of that transformation program? So I think people should just inquire about it and not actually deal with the first layer of offering that's presented around that term, and make sure that what is being meant is truly of value to that program.
How much of a role does legislative processes actually play in town transformation?
I'm going to ask that from a glass half full and from a glass half empty perspective. So if I answer from the glass half empty perspective, I would say not enough.
Okay.
And there's kind of opportunities that I would like to kind of illustrate of why I think that's not enough. And then I'll come to where I do think it's playing a positive role, and increasingly we will see more of that. Where we've seen some perhaps absences of legal frameworks is in notions where we kind of do have this notion of, let's say, where we've used in the case of renewable would be a very good example, where this notion of there is a proclamation happening, but it's done without a framework of accountability, a legal framework of, well, who is responsible for what as part of that proclamation process, not just the act of proclamation, but post that proclamation, where's the post-proclamation legislation that will govern to say to what extent is the private sector or the public sector or the civil society responsible for elements of that. I think another opportunity for improvement is where an industry, and it's quite relevant to manufacturing perhaps or extractive industries, where's their legislation to say, well, if you've played a particular role, post your role, as your role declines, whether that is in your control or not, what is your responsibility post fact? So there for a moment, if I draw on the case of Detroit, so Detroit was a very prominent city in the US economic landscape, and that hinged a lot around motor manufacturing. And then as automation took place or international competition led to other opportunities where that was outsourced as a capability, there was no real liability to that industries in terms of the devastation that it caused by choosing to extract their businesses and either move elsewhere or just fold. Not that there was good reasons why that happened, but there wasn't clear legislation that then governed that, similar to how mine closures are not perhaps at the moment well governed. So that's the glass half full perspective. I think where I want to move to the half empty perspective, where I move to the glass half full perspective, you see now a lot of legislation coming through in terms of environmental sustainability and to what extent that is legislated around what industries or societies or towns can even do, and that they need to comply with that. And if they don't, there's penalties towards that. And actually, which for me is hugely exciting, is this concept of where they looking to actually create this notion of commitment to future generations. That is actually where you almost have a implied legal contract with future generations of what obligations you owe them, as that's actually kind of beginning to move into spaces of law. And then the final part that I think is also very positive that we've already touched on is where special legislation are beginning to be passed to actually protect and govern these projects, to make sure that they can actually not be interfered with in terms of either economic or political interference. So I think there are places where I think there are still some gaps, but where there are really positive signs and progressive signs where laws are beginning to be used in a positive way to actually kind of aid these processes. Public-private partnerships in the context of Namibia in its next iteration I also foresee will play very strong legislative processes. So in simple ways, it will play a big role, an increasing role. But of course, we'll always have to watch for law, not something that stifles and constrains, that is used to enable and to make sure that there's appropriate governance structures that could be legalized.
I like the fact that you take both approaches.
Yes, as an ex-lawyer, one think really should, and that will be a sober way to do it.
It's also kind of probably to a degree managing expectations.
Absolutely. But it definitely it brings about certainty.
Yes.
It brings absolute clarity. In the absence of that, that's where you struggle, because then there's room for misinterpretation, different expectations, and then you begin to misdirect your stakeholders.
Yes.
That there's not something they can rely on that gives a very clear governance framework in which to operate.
So your responsibility and accountability is way up here, eh?
Yes, exactly. And ultimately also the decision makers, which is why one needs to kind of create these structures that you also protect the individuals.
Yeah, no, of course.
That there was kind of clear structure within which decisions were made in a very organized fashion that is transparent and evidence to being well considered of how public funds are being used and how opportunities for the country is developed in the right way. And yes, that people can be proud of that and also actually evidence it. So it's not just from a defense perspective,
yes,
but also from an offense perspective in terms of actually telling the story and be proud of that, and to actually can point towards quality work being done at government level and or a combination of government and or private sector and civil society. So I think there's lots of positives that are coming through. Of course, not everybody would like that, because some of it means that some of the hidden choices would now kind of need to become a bit more transparent. But I think there's more to be gained than what they will be lost in process of bringing about clearer governance on these programs.
Who tells your stories, these stories? Apart now from being on your, let's say, your podcast, for the lack of a better term now.
Yes. It's a fabulous and I think very creative part of these processes, and actually also, dare say, the more fun part of it. The way that I've used storytelling is to kind of look for, let's call it a marketing specialist, but a forward-thinking marketing specialist. So not your traditional kind of corporate brand, logo-oriented. People that can understand the notion of storytelling, the role it plays in the sense of place. And then through them in the beginning, you focus a lot around storytelling, around the past of the place, to kind of just make sure you begin to understand.
Yes.
So through that is begin to understand your heroes in your community, your society, your leaders. And those people then eventually begin to also tell the positive stories of what might be and what might come and the successes of that. Because then in a way you give more character to the transformation process, you give more color. All of us love stories.
Oh, yeah.
But through that, we also know through storytelling, you also bring almost about a sort of sense of manifestation, a sense of preemptive direction to what might be, and therefore it inspires and actually makes it all a lot more credible and almost leads people for that to become the reality because you foretold the story. Of course, you've got to do it with authenticity.
Yeah,
you can't kind of make it up. It's got to be very much grounded in fact. And I think in the case of Oranje Munt, I think their original foundational work that was done through Mike Frieden, myself originally, and then through myself, but then increasingly through some of the citizens, through the vehicle of OMD 2030, there's lots of storytelling that's happening. And also one of the economic diversification specialists that work for OMD, Renal van der Merwe, she's also incredibly talented through visuals, tell the story of how that process is transforming. So I think storytelling and finding the right partners in that process, very much like Bro Studios yourself, I think that is phenomenal to actually kind of begin to sort of tell the story from the outset.
It's really beautiful stories to tell.
Absolutely, and stories that becomes history, right? It becomes, our future today becomes tomorrow's history. So you do want to capture these processes. Now we've got a lot more means through which to do that. And I quite often advise companies and all these town transformation programs. I know it feels like it might be a bit of a distraction in the beginning, but I think it's the fun part, and it is a way to co-opt people into that process. But in future, it actually, in the moment, captures how difficult some of the process might have been. Quite often in hindsight, we remember only elements of it.
Yes.
And to actually tell the story as you progress, it's got a lot of value.
The importance of documenting something from start to finish.
Correct.
At that moment, like you said, it might hold very little value, but it's something that could play a phenomenal part.
Well, in future. Correct, exactly. So no, I'm definitely pro storytelling. There's a lot of information.
Yes.
And a lot of connectivity that we build that I think is vital. And it's so part of our human nature to tell stories. So I think, that's for me the fun part, the exciting parts of, or the less harder parts.
Yes.
More fun, I think, is the right description.
You started an interesting project in Greece. What inspired this?
Yes, Greece is a little bit of an anomaly in my portfolio. And I hope that more of these cases will soon be added to my portfolio. What is different in the case of Greece, is in the case of Greece, it was actually a project that we started to put our money where our mouth is. So here's where we didn't actually advise clients on what they should do, but we actually, out of our own pockets, started an agricultural initiative to actually aid the socioeconomic development of a particular town, a town called Pelefitou in on the Pella region of Greece. It was a variety of coincidences that led to us picking that particular environment. But with a Greek partner and myself, we actually started a niche stone fruit business that ultimately transformed a really subsistence farming focused environment into a little bit more open-mindedness to collective farming that led us to actually, through a niche product, could actually export products into higher earning markets. In fact, landed our peaches in Marks and Spencer, which is ultimately the Queen's kitchen in England. So that was for us a huge success, early on success, but used our own investment really to actually evidence that through good commercial principles, dare say, through profiteering principles, but not exploitive profiteering principles, we could bring about economic flow that could be spread more widely in a community that ultimately led to minor economic transformations, but also shifts in mindset of what could be done. So where the harmony comes at through economic and commercial gain, if you do it in the right way and with the right approach, that opportunity could be used to bring about and unlock potential for others.
And this project is running?
It's, yes, continuously to run. We had a few challenging years. I think anybody that is a farmer would know that that farming is definitely not perhaps the easiest way through which to bring about transformation. So we had through Weather Impact a few challenging years. But yes, this year is showing or proving to be a profitable year. So we are back to where we wanted to be despite a few challenging years where frost and hail and rain and excessive sun and wind, made it a bit more challenging to make that an easy success.
Well, congratulations. It sounds fantastic. Can I read about that?
Yes, so the variety, or we rephrase, is actually a South African plant material that we exported and have the exclusive license still to actually produce in Greece. And it's we've trademarked it under the name Santorin. So you can definitely kind of look that up. And then, of course, the product could be bought in its cycle in England.
Did this project have an impact on the livelihood of people?
It's a bit too early to tell because, of course, as we explained, unfortunately, we had unexpected quite a few critical years that kind of undermined our ability to reinvest and do a lot of the training and a lot of the community development work that we did do. But up until that point, and because it's subsistence farming, a lot of Greek farmers didn't have to comply with international standards of soil preservation, hygiene methods, social conditions under which you employ people. And just through the process of formalizing the industry somewhat, you bring about a very different level of thinking in terms of how to deal with the environment and make sure you embed sustainability principles. So through that level of education, you could see some level of education and therefore investment into a future came about. But we definitely also kind of saw more indirectly where a lot of people were more willing to evolve their thinking around subsistence farming and actually open their mindsets that if they actually approach this in a very different way, and perhaps by collaborating in some cases a bit more, although that's not direct successes, it's indirect successes. And of course, then ultimately through our farming strategies, we just offered a little bit more employment. So modest successes. But of course, hopefully, as we get more successful seasons, we will have enough or more available capital to reinvest and actually advance some of our strategies that are now a little bit behind.
but resilience and persistence, right?
Correct. Absolutely. Absolutely. Or redirection, as it might be in some cases.
Adapt.
Yeah. Very much so.
You've given us a lot of the lowdown, and you have a good idea of what it is that you would want when it comes to town transformation. So I want to know, if you were unconstrained by resources, what would your ideal town look like?
Well, it's fantastic. It's almost like, that's too much choice. It's almost like, sounds like magical moments. But I think, in those cases, what one would do is to kind of make sure that you, in an unconstrained manner, of course, can unlock all of the potential that you've identified. So what happens in the case of transformation projects in reality, because you are constrained by resources or political will or persuasion or commitment to it, you have to really strictly prioritize which ones you pursue. But I think if you have unconstrained access to resources and or political components, I think you will get to some of your results possibly a little bit faster, because you don't necessarily have to spend the time to kind of build deep democracies on decision-making in these places. And I think you would also have, almost like you have in companies where you have innovation strategies, where you have the agile methodology of be allowed to fail. You would a lot more freedom to actually kind of invest in pieces that might sound a little bit misdirected, but unexpectedly might be the linchpin that brings about the unexpected. So you will make less safe strategies possibly and play into that field of unexpected. And one of the cases I can draw on where that actually transpired is in the case of Bilbao. It's a town in Spain. And it was actually interesting enough also in its deep history, a mining town, but all sorts of other industries built around that. But then ultimately all of the industries in quite a close succession collapsed, and actually caused for a transformation initiative that was led by the government of Spain. And again, they had the fortitude to create a special purpose vehicle, and they had a lot of tax income that was directed to that, which again, I applaud the regional government in Spain for, and also the national government. But the point that I want to get to is they had all sorts of economic development strategies, but they had also cultural focus to create a Guggenheim Museum. And it happened to be in a moment in time where there was a lot of international interest in art, and a lot of famous people in the world invested in art and was very excited about the opportunity. And through this almost infamous attraction to this, it led to a huge tourism industry that wasn't quite foreseen. And, kind of again, because they kind of had this notion where a lot of funding was directed, it allowed a little bit of more greater ease of where they could spend their money. So yes, there was the bread and butter and key elements, but they also had this wild card that they could play, and it paid off way beyond expectations. So I think that's one way I would look to answer you. And I think to the other part of that, what makes an ideal town, I kind of think that's again, that depends on who you're talking to, because what is ideal for me might not be ideal for you. So I think it would be great if we had this instance where different towns could offer different attractions to people who have different priorities. And I think ideal with me is we get to the sense where I have a choice of where I could actually spend my places, and that place satisfies either my professional needs, but very much also my social and my cultural needs sufficiently, and that I could see myself creating a sense of belonging to that place. I think then you've created an ideal environment.
I love the idea of the concept of being allowed to fail, because that is unrestrained. You can then actually explore many different things, and you learn from that nonetheless.
Yes, absolutely. And I do think if you do a town transformation program, one should allocate a bit of thinking and or resources to that. But as I said, unfortunately, in resource-constrained environments, you don't always have that luxury. You could argue that, the line that, it's way too early to conceive that might be a success. But again, that represents a lot of play.
It does.
Not quite sure if it's going to be the ideal place to live in. We're going to hold out and kind of watch how that unfolds. But I think they definitely have a lot more resources that others don't have the luxury of, and therefore we can see how far the creativity is leading to go, almost to the point of possible misdirection, one could argue.
Okay, fantastic. But we can all dream.
Yes, we can all dream.
Thank you, Rita. That brings us to the conclusion of another episode. Just go back a bit, have a look at the other episodes where Rita discussed radical town transformation and the key players. And I think we'll be back in another episode, so keep watching. Thank you. Thanks, Rita.
Thank you very much, Jaco. Thank you for the time.